Welcome to This is ADHD. I'm your host, Chris Johnson. I started this podcast in 2023 as a way to celebrate ADHD Awareness Month. I wanted to do something different and have genuine conversations with real people about the experience of having ADHD and what life looks like. Through these conversations, I use my professional coaching skills, and we have conversations that jump around all over the place. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and if you look at the end, there's ways to reach out and contact me and talk about the podcast. Thank you for listening. Welcome back to This is ADHD. Today I am joined by Niki McGlynn. Hello, Niki. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Chris. My name is Niki McGlynn. I'm a neurodevelopment therapist and ADHD coach. I'm based just outside Reading in Wokingham in Berkshire.
Hello. It feels like we've been chatting for ages, Niki. Because I don't know, did we agree this like 5 months ago or something like that? It's been a long time.
Long time, yeah.
So I'll go straight in with the first question. What do you call your ADHD?
What do I call my ADHD? I just refer to it as ADHD, really. I don't subscribe to the idea that it's necessarily a superpower. And I think probably because I see the end where people are really, really struggling with symptoms. So, I think it can be a huge, huge benefit, but I think it's recognised as a disability for very good reasons.
Mm-hmm. And how did you kind of get into ADHD? How did you kind of go, I'm a normal, and normal being NEURMAL, so neuronormal. How did you go from one of them to neurodivergent? What was the journey?
I've basically followed my daughter, which I think is a fairly common process for women of a certain age. My daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia when she was 12. I had always thought she was dyslexic and kind of flagged it up at her primary schools, but that had been fairly dismissed because she's very good at masking. She's a bright girl. So she was just diagnosed with dyslexia when she was 12. I was 40 and also discovered I was dyslexic and dyscalculic, which is actually really a pain in the backside. And I had just gone my whole life thinking I was a bit thick. So it was quite a revelation to realise that actually there was a reason. And then similarly, my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD during lockdown when she was 22. And it was like, oh my God, how could I not see this? How could I not see this? So, yeah. But I think it's that whole thing. I've worked with people who are neurodiverse probably since about two. So it's not like it's a surprise, surprise. It's just this whole thing about understanding how ADHD manifests in women and girls, and it's so different. And particularly, my daughter has combined ADHD, so you can see that ADHD is quite obvious. But I have, I forgot what it's called. I have inattentive ADHD.
Inattentive.
So it's harder to spot.
Yeah. And could I just ask you, I know what it is, but I'm aware you're the first person to come on and talk about it. Dyscalculia. What's that one? Because we've not had it on the podcast before, and I know it's not the point of this episode, but you mentioned about dyscalculia. And I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining what that is for people.
So dyscalculia is essentially dyslexia with numbers. So it's where you can't process numbers, you can't remember numbers, they don't make any sense. And and that makes life really difficult when you live in a number-based society. So PIN numbers, phone numbers, addresses, running a business. It's all very difficult.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
So today, Niki, you do a lot of work on primitive reflexes, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. Would you mind kind of giving like a brief summary of what they are and how they help or don't help or are needed?
Oh, they don't help. Yeah. So retained primitive reflexes are movement patterns that all babies do. Excuse me, I'm catching your cough. All babies do all over the world, irrespective of creed, colour, anything. All babies make the same movements, and they're developmental movements. And those movement patterns allow the brain and the central nervous system to develop properly. So when those movement patterns can't express themselves, then we get issues around the development of the central nervous system. So they start in utero, and a lot of them are involved in the whole birthing process, and they integrate, excuse me, from about 6 months, actually a bit earlier than that, from about 3 months onwards, and they should all be integrated by sort of a year to 18 months. So when those reflexes aren't integrated and they stay active in your system, they produce very obvious symptoms, and a lot of those symptoms we would associate with things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, chronic anxiety. And those reflexes can also return after trauma. So fear reflexes can return after trauma, or some of the more physical reflexes can return after trauma. So, for instance, neck reflexes can reappear after whiplash, after a car accident. So, and all of those reflexes they affect the system as a whole, but they live in different parts of the body. And you can tell when reflexes are still active, because when your reflexes are well integrated, you should be able to move any part of your body without having to move any other part of your body. When those reflexes are still active, it's difficult to move your head, for instance, without the rest of your body getting involved, which sounds like a really odd thing to say, but if you stand up with your arms by your side and you move your head up and down, just forwards and backwards, you should be able to do that without having to move your arms or your shoulders or your back or your stomach or your legs. Usually you need somebody else to be able to observe that, to see what's going on. But that's a good indication of a retained neck reflex.
And I'm still not really clear on what these reflexes are. So is it like movements, or is it?
They're movement patterns. So probably the only reflex that people are generally familiar with is the Moro reflex, or the baby startle reflex, and that's a reflex that starts in the womb, should integrate by about 3 months. And if you've ever been around a baby, it's the reflex that when there's a loud noise or a sudden movement near a baby, it sort of jerks. It does this kind of electric jerk where it jerks its arms and legs forward and its head forward. And then usually after that, it cries. So that is a movement pattern that comes from effectively what the baby perceives as a shock. It's a survival reflex. So something will happen, a loud noise or a bright light or a sudden movement around a baby, and it jerks its arms and legs forward and its head forward, and it will cling. Well, actually, that's not strictly true. It jerks its arms and legs back first. So it kind of, if it's curled up, it will fling its arms and legs back and its head back. And then after that, it will move forwards and cling on to whoever comes along and picks it up. So there's this kind of fling back and gasp, and then pull forwards and cling on. And that whole thing is the movement pattern. So the first stage of the movement pattern is that opening out, flinging back, flinging the head back, gasping. And then the second part of the movement pattern is moving forwards and clinging on, and usually crying. So that whole process is the movement pattern.
Okay. And so, and then you said about integrating them. So what does kind of integration look like? Is that kind of them disappearing, or?
Yeah, so they don't ever disappear. What they do is which is why they integrate, they don't disappear. So they integrate into your central nervous system, so then you don't you don't see them there any longer, but they are still part of our system. So they live within our system and can re-emerge if necessary. So, for instance, if you have a car accident, then sometimes those neck reflexes can re-emerge. So that what I was talking about earlier about if you move your head forwards and backwards, that's also a movement pattern. That's called your tonic labyrinthine neck reflex. So if you imagine that you have a line that cuts your body in half, sort of down the side of your head and the side of your neck and your shoulder and the side of your body, that's a midline. If you move your head either forwards beyond that midline or backwards beyond that midline, that will then trigger a movement pattern called your tonic labyrinthine neck reflex. So what happens when you move your head forwards is the instinct of your body is to collapse forwards. So you move your head forwards and your body collapses. So your arms collapse in, your legs collapse in, and you collapse. If you move your head backwards beyond that midline, the opposite happens and you hyperextend. So your neck hyperextends, your chest will hyperextend, your legs tighten, your arms tighten. So again, this is this movement pattern of going forwards for collapse, backwards for hyperextension. So this is part of the birthing process in babies, and it's part of that whole developmental process of babies being able to eventually roll over and move. So when it's retained in older children and in adults, that then presents issues around being able to control your body. So where you see somebody who typically, when they're working at a desk, they slump on their desk, they find it difficult to hold themselves upright. I mean, this will be familiar to some of your listeners at school, where to sit upright and pay attention, when they teach to sit up and pay attention, look at the board, you can sit up and pay attention, or you can slump on your desk and pay attention. You can't do both because that reflex is still present. So as soon as you move your head forwards, the urge to collapse is overwhelming because it's a reflex. It's not a thought process. But to be able to remain upright is a thought process. You have to think about staying upright. So that then causes lots of problems. You're slumping on your desk, you don't have very good core strength, it affects your coordination. Neck reflexes generally are associated with processing, so dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. So it gives you problems with spatial awareness, time awareness, so that's where time blindness can often come from. Being able to hit a ball, being able to look at a board and look at your desk and write can have problems with that. So these movement patterns that start as babies then have big implications as we get older.
And kind of how does this link into kind of the wider ADHD lens as well?
So from an ADHD perspective, when you look at ADHD type symptoms, you can see that showing up very clearly in reflexes. So the main reflex that we think about being associated with ADHD is the reflex called the spinal gland, which lives either side of the lower spine, and it's a birthing reflex. So it's associated with the birthing process. And essentially what happens when a baby's being born, as it wriggles down the birth canal and the birth canal presses against that baby's lower back, it causes its hip and shoulder to move towards themselves. So the hip and shoulder will move towards themselves to the side, and then the other side, hip and shoulder. So essentially it encourages the baby to wriggle down the birth canal. So if that reflex remains active after the point where it should have integrated, then what you see are lots of problems around the lower spine. So lots of problems with waistbands, labels, being able to sit with your lower back against a chair is really difficult. And also that reflex interferes with parts of the brain developing properly that allow you to be still. So being able to sit still is a developmental process, and it's quite an advanced part of development. If you think babies move all the time, and then as they get older, they become more able to be still. If that reflex is still active, that ability to be still is never attained. And again, it's a reflex, so it's not an intellectual process. It's a reflex, like blinking is a reflex. So it's really, really difficult to be still. So you have to move all the time. So that impulse to move that you see in people with ADHD, whether it's gross movements or just general fidgeting, comes from that spinal gland reflex. And it also is associated with things like impulsivity, that shouting out thing. Also, interestingly, late bedwetting. So that often is an issue I find with people with ADHD, that there's often an issue around bladder control, and that is also a spinal gland issue. Lower back problems as well, bowel problems. These reflexes have really, really a big influence on us, and nobody knows about them. I mean, that's the thing that I find so bananas. When I found out about them, I was like, well, why does nobody know about this? They have this really, really profound effect on how we function, both as children and as adults. Nobody knows about it. It's a secret.
And so I'm kind of thinking, like, with the hyperactivity side of ADHD and the kind of movement pieces as well, is it a one-to-one with this? Is there like scientific evidence to say, okay, here is, sorry, I've forgotten the name of the reflex. Is it one-to-one, or is it every 20%, 30% people? Is it, what's the kind of science to back it up?
They have the reflexes retained.
Yeah.
I don't actually know as a percentage. There's lots of research, and there's lots of new research being done, which is quite exciting. Dr. Robert Melillo, who's a chiropractor in America, has done quite a lot of research. Svetlana Muskatova, she's done quite a lot of research. There's different bodies at various places in the world who are doing current research really to evidence the issues associated. But reflexes, a bit like all of neurodevelopmental issues, are a spectrum. So you can have reflexes retained slightly, or you can have reflexes retained profoundly. So if you have a reflex that's only slightly retained, then it only really causes slight problems. If you have a reflex that's profoundly retained, you'd have trouble sitting on a chair.
Okay. And so, what do you do if you think if you know you've got ADHD, you know you've got issues with sitting still? How does someone kind of identify if it's a reflex thing? How can they kind of work on it?
So, I guess so there's various tests that you can do. I mean, obviously you can come and see somebody like me, but I work face to face. There are people around, but there aren't really enough of us yet. So you can go and get an assessment, but you can also find this stuff on the internet. There's quite a lot of stuff on YouTube about testing for reflexes. The test for the spinal gland reflex is really simple. You take a pen or the back of your thumb, your thumbnail, and stroke it down the spine from sort of middle to down towards your bottom, towards the top of your bottom, and if that reflex is retained, then you'll get a twitch. Sometimes you get a really big twitch, sometimes you get a slight twitch, sometimes you don't get a twitch because the reflex hasn't emerged properly, and then that gets a bit more complicated. So like with most things, that you can work on things on a fairly superficial level. When it gets more complicated, then you probably need to go and see somebody. But these are movement patterns, so the way to encourage them to integrate is through movement, but it's finding the right movement and the right movement for you. So that's what I do. I identify with people what movements will I don't look at what movements will work on their retained reflexes. I look at what movements their central nervous system will embrace. Because when you're looking at doing things that change your brain, you need to do them in a way that feels comfortable and safe. And if you try and force yourself to do something that doesn't feel comfortable or safe, or you hate, then it's not going to work. So you have to find something that works for you. And that's probably the tricky part of it. But all sorts of things will encourage reflexes to integrate. Dancing is amazing. Rhythm, we know that rhythm really, the brain really embraces rhythm. We are rhythmic beings. We are rhythmic beings from the point of conception onwards. So rhythm makes a massive difference in working with brain stuff. So dancing particularly is particularly good. And dancers tend to have quite well integrated reflexes. So most people have a degree of unintegrated reflexes these days, mostly because of how we bring our children up nowadays. But dancers tend to have well integrated reflexes because they have to be able to move their body well. Sportsmen, though, interestingly, don't necessarily have well integrated reflexes because they only work on one part of the body. So, and you see that when you see sports people doing Strictly and how uncoordinated they are. I always think that's so amazing when you see how bad they are at dancing, because they don't have that rhythm, because all of their focus is just on moving their body in a certain way. So yeah, I mean, sports people understood about reflexes and integrating reflexes, it would make a massive, massive difference on their sporting ability and reduction in injuries.
So what I'm hearing is kind of, if you work on your primitive reflexes, if you're fully integrated, then you are by definition more coordinated across a wider scope of activities.
Absolutely.
And when people are kind of looking these things up online,
it's not just physical. So it's physical, mental, and emotional. They have physical, mental, and emotional impacts. So and particularly when you look at things like the fear reflexes, the Moro reflex, which we talked about at the beginning, which is a fear reflex. It's a fundamental fear reflex and sits behind lots of the anxiety issues we see today that people deal with. And prior to the Moro reflex, there's a reflex called the fear paralysis reflex. So our understanding more nowadays about how stress manifests and a better understanding of the vagus nerve and how that works. So reflexes tie in with how the vagus nerve works. So your first reflex to develop is your fear paralysis reflex, and that shuts down your whole system. So when you look at things like selective mutism or that real big social anxiety where you find yourself in a social situation and you literally can't move, can't speak, that's a fear paralysis reflex kicking in.
Sorry, I'm taking notes and thinking at the same time.
Right.
So
I'm so conscious of not kind of going into well.
So when we're kind of looking at the reflexes and kind of going, here's an external behaviour, here's an internal reflex. Is it always that, or is there combinations?
Yeah. Well, yes. So for instance, if people have retained fear reflexes, and I would say that the a really high percentage, probably 80 to 90% of the people I see in my clinic have retained fear reflexes. And those fear reflexes kind of act as a gateway for all the other reflexes. So if your fear reflexes are retained, it's very likely that you will also have retained the majority of your other reflexes, because they stop those reflexes integrating well. So so when people come and see me, and I'll do a report at the end of the appointment, and often there's like this huge list of reflexes, and I think parents are often horrified. But the important thing to remember is that we don't work reflex by reflex. It's much better to work on the central nervous system as a whole, because that allows those reflexes to integrate naturally. In the same way that as a baby develops, those reflexes should just naturally integrate together. There is a sequence to them, but they work together and they integrate together. So once you start working on them, you should find that they would start to settle in. We don't do this bit and this bit and this bit and this bit. We work with a person, work holistically with the whole person, and that seems to get the best results. But retained fear reflexes are a real real handicap for people, because they and that's when you look at things like rejection sensitivity, that's a fear reflex issue. When you look at phobias, that's a fear reflex issue. When we look at sensory processing issues, that is also a fear reflex issue. So if people have issues around noise or light or textures of clothes, labels, again, sometimes that's a sensory processing issue, and that's associated with fear reflexes. So if we can encourage those reflexes to integrate, all of those symptoms improve.
I'm just thinking, when we're talking about these, I wonder about people kind of listening to this in the future as well, of going, the reflexes aren't necessarily the cause as well, if that makes sense. of saying
Um,
it's not always a
I
one
think
to
it's so
one.
much more complicated than that. And
Yeah.
I think when we talk about cause, you know, I'm sure you find as well, but, you know, there's a big conversation around ADHD doesn't exist, it's just trauma. Well, I think that's it's too reductionist. It's a really complicated subject. Brains, people are complicated. So do retained reflexes cause neurodiversity? I don't think so. I think we see that genetic predisposition. We see, we see that whole family line. But definitely, retained reflexes can worsen those symptoms, and definitely by encouraging reflexes to integrate, a lot of the more difficult parts of being neurodiverse improve. So, you know, and I see that all the time. I've seen it in myself, and I see it in my clients all the time, that, you know, things like emotional regulation. So emotional regulation, again, is a fear reflex issue. That's a moro reflex issue. Moro reflex is associated with fight and flight. So if you can calm that reflex down and encourage it to integrate, then you have better emotional control and a better emotional regulation, which makes your life easier. Does that cure your ADHD? No. You'll still have ADHD, but will you be able to deal with it better? Absolutely. This is why I'm so passionate about it, Chris. There's a really simple process that you can go through to improve your life. The issues, of course, are around if you've got ADHD, having to do something regularly, not to have that, you know, sofa monster stop you being able to get on and do it, you know. And I'm guilty of it myself. I don't do my movements as regularly as I should. And sometimes I'll really come up against something, you know, that I've done, a big ADHD tax or whatever, and I'll think, oh my God, I must go and do my movements. Why am I not doing my movements? So it's you know, the whole process is complicated. When you're neurodiverse, it's complicated. If you have really strongly retained fear reflexes and you start to do a movement program that encourages those fear reflexes to integrate, your system pushes back against it, because part of that whole way of being is a fear of change. So when you start to do a movement program that starts to change things, that in itself can stop you doing it, because the change is too stressful to deal with. It's not a magic bullet, but it does help.
Yeah. I think this is, the more I talk to people with, who help people with ADHD, it's always that thing of it as part of a wider plan of going, like, medication
Absolutely.
is good if it works for you. Coaching
Absolutely.
is good if it works for you. Reflex is good if it works for you. And then it's that thing of kind of trying to work out what can be done in parallel and what can be done in isolation as well.
Yeah. So for instance, if you wanted to do a movement program, the nice thing about, because it's not exercises either, you know, it's movements. It's moving your body in a particular way. And it doesn't take very long. It's only a few minutes a day. So it's very low. The process is very low stress. But sometimes that doesn't help, because sometimes people with ADHD want that adrenaline buzz that will then, you know, by running for 10 miles or, you know, lifting really heavy weights, just lying on the floor and rocking yourself backwards and forwards doesn't have enough of a reward to make it worth maintaining. So then you have to look at things the other things that will help support that. So the nice thing about a movement program is you can use it alongside anything else. So you can use it alongside medication or lion's mane or mindfulness or an exercise program or dietary changes or whatever you decide to do. You can do a movement program alongside. It's very, very gentle.
I think when we talked about this before recording, Niki, we talked about breathing being one of these reflexes. Did we talk about breathing being one of the reflexes, one that controls breath?
So breathing is associated with those fear reflexes. So the moro reflex is associated with that first breath when you're born. You know, that in the olden days they used to pick babies up and smack their bottoms. That was to trigger the moro reflex, which then triggers that first inhalation. So we don't do that to babies anymore, thankfully. But issues around breathing, breath holding, and I see a lot of people who breath hold is a fear paralysis reflex, and issues around breathing generally is a moro reflex. So working on your breathing will also encourage those reflexes to integrate. Working on those reflexes will improve your breathing.
And
we know,
of
course, the big association with breathing and calming your vagus nerve. So if you want to calm your vagus nerve, we talk about box breathing, where you breathe in for a number, breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. To calm your vagus nerve, you need the out breath to be longer than your in breath. So then I talk about parallelogram breathing, because obviously I'm a maths nerd, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 5, breathe out for 6, hold for 5, breathe in for 4. And then that helps to calm your system much more quickly.
Yeah, it's almost that thing of, if your body is reacting in a certain way, it feeds into the anxiety or the emotions that are being felt, and it's a bit of a runaway.
Yeah, and of course that's the other issue is that people. So when you say expand the top, that then increases that adrenaline cycle. So it's really important to breathe down into your lungs, breathe into your belly. But if you don't know how to do that, if you've never done that, that's a really difficult thing to conceptualize. So this is where often going to see somebody who understands about breathing can be useful, because they can help you by guiding you physically about where your breath should go. But breathing's there's that whole new book on breathing, isn't there, which I started to read and didn't get very far with.
I've not read that. I've got a book on breathing that I need to start. But I do know from like public speaking training and from various different things of controlling the breath, especially for me, something, I think we talked about this before, hypercapnia, which is, there's not a lot of evidence for it yet being related to ADHD, but it's about being able to regulate the breath, and it's that kind of runaway fear process of going, like, actually, if you can get your breath under control, you can relax down and into it and do the thing that is worrying you. And there's lots and lots of evidence that shows that association. Even just the biology of that makes sense. So Niki, what personal impact has this had for you in terms of working on your primitive reflexes? What have you seen different?
When I did my exercises regularly, it was really great. When I did my movements, it was really great. One of the things I noticed, like when things get better, you don't notice them anymore. You notice the things that are difficult. You don't notice them when they're better. But one of the things that I noticed when I was being really good was that I had to fly to Holland to do some teaching. And when I got off now I have a real fear of falling, a really big fear of falling. And if ever I'm having to come downhill or downstairs, I'm always terrified I'm going to fall and I have to hold on. So I'm all right going up, but coming down is a real issue. Is practically a phobia. So we were talking earlier about that reflex that when you put your head forwards, your body collapses. So that's part of that reflex, that when you put your head beyond that midline, your instinct is to collapse. So if you're trying to walk down somewhere, you have this overwhelming feeling all the time that you're going to fall, because what your body wants to do is collapse forwards. So anybody who has problems coming downstairs, that's what sits behind that. It's that tonic labyrinthine reflex. So I had to get off this plane in Holland. I had a suitcase, I had a bag of a briefcase and a rucksack. So I had 3 bags, and I had to get off the plane and come down the steps onto the tarmac. Now, ordinarily, I would have either had to get somebody else to take one of the bags, or I'd have had to do it in 2 trips. But I got off that plane without holding on, carrying all my bags, without even realising that I'd done it. And it was only when I was walking across the tarmac into the airport that I realised that I'd been able to do that. And it sounds like a really small thing, but it was a really, really noticeable impact.
It's that thing of like, it's not a small thing.
I'm
You were
sorry?
disabled. It's doesn't sound like a small impact. It's that thing of like you are actively disabled, of not being able to carry that stuff down without holding on.
Yeah.
It's a
And now all of
massive
a sudden I
difference.
could do it. So that's probably for me the most dramatic thing that changed. But I think more generally things like being more organised. My business is called Organised Mind, which was always such a joke because I'm not very organised at all. But I was more organised, more able to process information. I'm good at auditory processing. I'm not very good at visual processing, so that improved. So yeah, I mean, there's a general sense of feeling like I had my life more together.
That sounds good enough for me.
Because of course the thing with reflexes is you can work on your reflexes at any age, but with children, the younger they are, the more of an effect it has, and the less time it takes, and the more of a long-term impact it has. I mean, obviously, and that's a massive generalisation. But with adults, you can encourage those reflexes to integrate, but generally you have to keep working at it. It's not something, because you've had 50 years of being in a certain way. So to correct that, you have to keep going with it. But it's not a lot. Excuse me.
No,
It's not a huge amount of effort. It's that little bit of extra headspace of doing it every day. And in fact, once you're even as an adult, once things are going well, you don't even have to do it every day. You can do it, sort of 3, 4, 5 times a week. But you have to keep doing it.
and that's as you said, always the challenge with ADHD is being consistent.
Always the challenge. Yeah. So and we know that even things like brushing your teeth is an issue for some people with ADHD. So, because we don't create habits in the same way that neurotypical people do. So it's like with everything else, it's finding a way to make it work for you in your life so that your life then works better.
Is there something about saying if you do things like yoga or like you were saying dancing and things like that also works on these things, as also it's not just
Absolutely.
Go and do primitive reflex work. It's that thing of it's holistic approach of going like if you're moving your body.
Anything that moves your body will work on your brain. If you don't move your body, your brain can't develop, and your brain develops until you die. So anything that involves movement will help. So the more rhythmic it is, the better it is. So martial arts are great. Yoga's great, Pilates. And the more organised your body is, the more organised your brain is. The more.
No, I like that. So if people are looking this up online, so primitive reflexes is the thing to look up. What other terms would people be kind of looking for?
So primitive reflex is probably the main one. Neurodevelopment, that's what I call myself, neurodevelopment therapist. And then the particular reflexes all have particular issues. And if you go on my Facebook page or on my website, on my Facebook page particularly, there's quite a lot of little videos explaining about different reflexes and what they do and how they affect you.
Yeah. And just because that's a lovely segue, Niki, how can people kind of get in contact with you and follow your work?
So Facebook is probably my main place. I try and do more Instagram. I'm not very good at Instagram. I've got a couple of videos on TikTok. It's kind of my New Year's resolution is to be a bit more visible, which is why it's really great to do this actually. So thank you. But part of my New Year's resolution is to be a bit more visible, just to try and get people to hear about primitive reflexes and understand that there is something that you can practically do to help, that it isn't just medication, and really that understanding, that awareness. And I think as well, one of the things when you get a diagnosis, like I spent my whole life thinking I was a bit thick because I struggled at school, because I had undiagnosed dyslexia and ADHD. So when you get a diagnosis, I think that's incredibly liberating to know that actually, no, I'm not just a bit thick. And then understanding primitive reflexes is another step on from that. So you go, okay, so it's not just that I am lazy or uncoordinated, or this is because my reflexes are unintegrated, and I can do something about that. So so Facebook, bit of Instagram, bit of TikTok, might be there a bit more if I get my act together.
And are you Niki? Sorry, I was going to say, are you Niki McGlynn everywhere? Organised mind.
I'm organised mind with an S, not a Z, because I'm English. Okay. So organised mind. And I have my logo is a little man throwing starfish back into the sea who looks like a dancer, which is a famous little story. And on my website there's a video. It's a pay to access video, but it's a sort of deep dive into primitive reflexes, what they are, what they're called, how they manifest. It's just under an hour, I think. And then I'm also training through the year. I've got training courses listed to train people in understanding primitive reflexes and the movements that you can use to encourage them to integrate. So if you're interested in taking it that step further, then I've got those. My first one's at the end of January, but I think I've got one most months, either for groups or individuals. And I really encourage any sort of therapist, whether you're a body worker, a massage therapist, psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, whatever kind of therapy you do, I really, really encourage you to find out about primitive reflexes, because it's such an easy add-on to give people as a bit of homework to go home and do, that can really make a massive difference to how well their therapy works. Osteopaths, chiropractors, anybody, come and do the training. It's great.
I might have a look and see as well for myself.
It's really good fun as well, because it's very hands-on, very interesting, I think.
And Niki, final question for the day is, if you could go back and tell yourself pre-ADHD, pre-dyspraxia, dyslexia and dyscalculia, what would you tell yourself?
What would I tell myself? Get diagnosis. I'm not stupid. I think when you realise, as an adult, particularly when you realise there's often a lot of grief tied up with understanding all of those things that you've beat yourself up about over the years weren't actually your fault. And I still do now, even though now I know, I still think, well, I should, and it's miserable. It's miserable.
Yeah. I think my recommendation for everyone,
the risk of undiagnosed ADHD has more of an impact on life expectancy than smoking. And I think, and that's one of the reasons why, I really want people to know about this stuff, because even if you don't have a diagnosis, or even if you don't think it's relevant, understanding about primitive reflexes can still make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. And one point I was going to make as well is, if you're going through the diagnosis process, I would highly recommend for everyone to have either therapy or coaching which is ADHD aware, either with a coach or therapist that has ADHD or has got significant experience and understanding of the disorder as well.
Yeah.
Because it is...
I really, really agree with that.
Yeah, and it's not something that you get...
There's so many moving parts to ADHD that we just didn't realise.
Yeah.
And even things for women, if I can go off on a bit of a tangent, but for women and the impact on your hormones of ADHD, there's a massive, I don't know what the percentages are, but the period issues, things like endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, painful periods, are much, much higher in women with ADHD. And similarly, when you go through the menopause, your ADHD symptoms, because there's a big association between dopamine and estrogen, as your estrogen drops, your dopamine drops, and all of a sudden these ADHD symptoms come out, loud and proud, and people dismiss it as menopause, and it's not. It's and that's why you're seeing this massive increase in older women getting a diagnosis. Is we were all missed through school because we could mask, and through the workplace, and then all of a sudden you hit menopause and you don't have the wherewithal to do it anymore. that's the whole part of ADHD, which is poorly understood.
Yeah, I think it's that thing of like girls couldn't have ADHD according to the original criteria. And you grew out of ADHD when you turned 16. That was a magic year. So it was like, okay, cool, you're an adult. You can't have ADHD now.
Yeah.
So, really? That's lifelong, developmental disorder. It's going to impact you at every single aspect of it.
Yeah. It just shows differently, Yes, you're not bouncing off the walls anymore. You're sat in your room on your own because you've got massive anxiety and depression. Because you spent your whole life getting told off.
Yeah, and some of that telling off is not even real telling off as well. Is that thing of it's been implied, and we've picked up on it and taken it as real.
We've embraced
which I know is hard. We've embraced it. So thank you so much, Niki, for coming in today. It's really
difficult. I was talking to somebody about. Oh, pleasure.
Is there any? Sorry, I spoke over you. Then what was that?
I was just going to say about rejection sensitivity dysphoria and how it's like being a vampire, that you have to be invited in. That when people say, "Come on, let's all go to the pub," those people with ADHD think they don't mean them. They mean everybody but them, and that's a tricky one.
Yeah, we have to be invited 2 or 3 times and possibly had a little word alongside as well, going like, really want you to be there. They go, maybe you're talking to me. Maybe I wanted the things that we all work on.
Yeah. But I think that now that conversation is being had, now that I didn't ever know that. I never knew that I had it. I never knew it was a thing. I just, and so many times I've spoken to people who have said, but they don't really like me. Well, they do really like you. This is just your brain's telling you lies.
Yeah. And I think there's something as well that I have noticed is that when we like people, or at least when I like people, I hyper focus on them, and that is probably too much attention. And going like, actually. My expectation is someone's going to hyper-focus on me. It's like, no, that's not healthy for me to do that, and I shouldn't be expecting other people to do that. Even that I make all ADHD friends.
I think, well, at least they'll understand.
Exactly. So, Niki, are there any last messages that you kind of want to put out before we close today?
I don't know. I think I've said everything. Other than find out about primitive reflexes. It might just change your life.
Such a throwaway statement. Might just change your life.
It does. It is. I mean, it is life changing. People go, "Oh my God!" So this is this, and I think it's the fact that you can do something about it. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a cure. It's not, and it's slow. It's like going to the gym. It's slow, but it explains why these things are difficult, and it gives you tools to do something about it. And I think that's pretty life changing.
Yeah, I know that my best mental health was when I was training for a marathon, doing that constant exercise and kind of checking in with myself and looking after my body and weightlifting and all of that. Yeah. That was definitely, something that I need to get back to at some point.
And that's the rub, isn't it?
Yeah. Finding the time to do it and the commitment.
Well, and the motivation, because when that hyperfixation's gone, it's gone. You can't get it back.
Yeah, and not being good at something immediately as well.
Yeah.
Going back to running and going, I can't run a half marathon now. I can only run like 500 meters.
Yeah. That not being
so
good
much.
Straight away is a killer.
Thank you so much, Niki, for your time today.
Pleasure.